Hello, today I am going to cover clause 751 general, which doesn't tell us a lot, with regards to documented information. What I'm sharing with you is the clause statement from 9001, ISO 9001, and you'll see it's 7.5 documented information, and it's just this general clause. You will have found, if you've gotten this far through the standard already, that there's quite a few clauses that do have at the commencement of each sub clause a general clause, and it really just gives us an idea of what it's about, what's coming up essentially. This one is a little bit different. I think it's really a really important clause because it explains to us in a little bit more detail the requirements for documented information that are mandatory, and then anything else, any other documented information that we require. So I'll explain it to you. So it says the organization's quality management system shall include A, documented information required by this international standard. Okay, pretty straightforward. So wherever you have seen in ISO 9001 where it states that documented information is to be retained or maintained or be available, well, you have to do it. Okay, it's spelt out for you in the standard. There's quite a few clauses throughout that require documented information. So this is just simply saying, well, if it says that you need documented information in a clause, well, you shall include it. Okay, it's a requirement. Now it goes on to B, where it says documented information determined by the organisation as being necessary for the effectiveness of the quality management system. I'll say it again, emphasising different words. So it says documented information determined by the organisation as being necessary for the effectiveness of the quality management system. Right, so this clause is saying, well, one, you need to have what we say you have to have documented, that's A. But then in B it says, well, if you believe that documented information will support your system to ensure that your quality management system is effective, well, then you will have it as well. You will create it. You can create it. So if we're looking at this from the perspective of, say, a hierarchy of control, we all know documentation is part of the hierarchy of control. It's a lower level control, but to maintain consistency of output, and in particular this is quality, so this is about the output and the service that we provide to our customers. We want that consistent output, don't we? So there might be some clauses within the standard where it doesn't specifically say you shall maintain documented information or you shall retain documented information, but that doesn't mean you can't have it. Okay, if you think it will support your system, if you think, oh, we need to have this procedure documented so people can follow it, or we might need a checklist here to ensure that everyone that touches this process does and follows the same steps, well, then you do it. Okay, this is all about making your system more solid, okay, mature, robust is probably the better word. Okay, now some of you might think, oh, well, if it doesn't say I have to have documentation, well, I'm not doing it. Well, that's fair enough. that's your choice. However, I will point out that what you might find is that those are the steps in your process or the areas in your system that you might end up with non-conformances. You might end up with customer complaints or feedback. Okay, so it will come around full cycle. All right, so if you have missed an area that may benefit from documented information being retained or maintained, then you might come full circle if there is a non-conformance or a complaint, and you might decide at that point, yeah, you know what, this might be more manageable if we have a procedure or if we have a checklist. All right, so that's sort of the mindset that you need for B. Now, to finish off, there is a note at the end of clause 751, and the note says the extent of documented information for a quality management system can differ from one organisation to another due to the size of the organisation, its type of activities, processes, products and services, the complexity of processes and their interactions, and the competence of persons. Okay, so this is really important to understand. There will be a different level of documentation depending on the size of the business. All right, so if we're talking an international or global business with tens of thousands of employees scattered all over the world, we would tend to expect much more documentation, okay, because there's a lot more to try to control and manage as compared to a family business that has one location, and it's just, say, the husband and wife running the business. They would have far less documentation requirements because they would be working together and the communication would be on the go and verbal. Okay, I'm not saying that they wouldn't benefit from having some additional areas as per B documented. However, we would expect for them to have less areas documented than an international global company. So that's that size of the business. And of course, if it's a complex or a high risk product or service that you deliver, again, you would tend to have a lot more documentation because, as I mentioned before, this is a control essentially. Okay, so more complex or higher risk products and services will tend to have more documentation than a lower risk product or service. All right, I hope that helps you, and have fun with documented information. Thank you. Today I'm going to cover clause 7.5.2, creating and updating. This creating and updating is all about documented information. Okay, so the clause states, and remembering this is in ISO 9001 I'm covering, the clause states when creating and updating documented information, the organisation shall ensure appropriate A, identification and description. Now, there's some examples in the brackets there that says a title, date, author, or reference number. So when we look at documentation and we're looking for documentation, we want to understand what it is. So that's that identification and description. So possibly the name of the documented information, the name of the file might be relevant to what it actually is. It would be great if there was a date or a revision or version number on there as well, because when we're looking for documented information, we want to know, is it current or not? So, and then some documented information might also have who the author is. So these are just examples, okay? It doesn't mean it's mandatory or all of them are mandatory. This is what's mandatory: identification and description. So however you decide to do that, whether it be in the title, whether it be the date, whether it be a version number or revision number or reference number, that is up to you and the organisation. Okay, these are just some examples of what you might consider when you're determining what your identification and description is for your documented information. Okay, then we have B, format and media. So documented information can be in many formats and medias. Okay, I'm probably stating the obvious there. But when we think of documented information, we might traditionally just go back to thinking about written procedures. Okay, but documented information can be in the form of images or graphics. It can be in the form of different software versions. It can be your marketing collateral. It can be video, so video training that you might produce. So all of those types of documented information still need this identification and description, but you need to determine what these different formats and medias are. Okay, and getting right back to basics, it could be, well, this type of documented information is in paper format, or it's always electronic. You need to determine this format and media for your own system. Okay, and then finally, C says review and approval for suitability and adequacy. So this final one, review and approval for suitability and adequacy. So part of your system or your process when you create and update your documented information is you need to have some sort of review and approval process. So you might have an SME document a new procedure or update an existing procedure, but it should always go through a review process. So someone's checking it to see, one, is it accurate? Two, does it actually make sense? And then this final approval as well. So who's going to approve that final revision of your documented information for release, whether that release is internal or external. Okay, I hope that explains this little tiny part of clause 7.5 documented information, all about creating and updating your documented information. Today I'm going to walk you through clause 7.5.3, control of documented information. I'm going to break it down and give you some examples along the way so that you can take it away and apply it within your own organisation. So stick with me. Now, it's broken down into these two subclauses, 7.5.3.1 and 7.5.3.2. Right? So 7.5.3.1 is telling us that documented information required by the quality management system and by this international standard, so that means by ISO 9001:2015, shall be controlled to ensure A, it is available and suitable for use where and when it is needed. Okay, let's think about that. It is available, suitable for use where and when it is needed. Okay, so if we need to access documented information within our organisation, we need to ensure it's available to the right people. It's suitable for their use. So do they need it in electronic form? Do they need it to be able to access on a tablet? Does it need to be in hard copy? Does it need to be more visual, like a video, for example? So then where and when it is needed as well. So this is all about the suitability or determining the suitability or the type of documented information that your organisation is going to create to ensure it does the best job it possibly can for the people that need it.
All right, so they need it to be available so they can access it. And how? So as I mentioned before, hard copy, electronic, video, images even, and then is it available where and when it's needed? All right, so that might apply to different types of information across your business. Okay, I'm trying to think. An example here at Atoll is we have documentation either on Dropbox, we have it in OneNote, we have video, so we do Vimeo records. We use Asana, a project management platform, which has documentation in it. So we have created all these different types of documented information in different platforms that are available to people. It's suitable. So we've chosen, well, which ones are just in Dropbox, which ones are in OneNote, which ones are Vimeo records, and which ones are in Asana. And so therefore people can access it, what they need to access, where and when it's needed. Right? I hope that breaks that down a bit more for you. Then the next section says B, it is adequately protected. For example, from loss of confidentiality, improper use, or loss of integrity. Okay, so if you're creating this documented information, you need to make sure it's protected. So if you're saving your documented information electronically, you might think about different levels of access from different people. Is it read only to some of the team, or can other members of the team edit the document? Okay, so you need to protect it. If it's hard copy, of course, I'm just thinking straight off the top of my head, particularly if you're archiving it or storing it, is it looked after? Is it protected, or is it in the elements? Something I remember years ago on an audit is I went into like an outdoor shed, and there was boxes and boxes of archive boxes there, and I opened them all, and they were sort of, I think, like training records, but because they had been stored in this shed, it actually wasn't waterproof, so they'd actually been damaged. So these training records were integral to the business to be retained for evidence of assessments, etc., but they hadn't been adequately protected. Okay, so that's one example for hard copies. Improper use, I think, that's, and confidentiality comes into that. Make sure only the right people, the people that you want to access the documentation, are getting access. Okay, so you're looking after it that way. So that covers 7531. Now, 7532 says, for the control of documented information, the organisation shall address the following activities as applicable. So remember that as applicable section, all right? Because some of these might not be applicable to you, all right? So just always remember that. So A says distribution, access, retrieval, and use. Okay, so to control our documented information, we need to ensure that we address distribution. So how are we distributing the documentation? Is it controlled, or are we just, putting it out there and anyone can access it? Okay, so that's not protecting it, going back to here. So what is your distribution process? This might depend on what the documented information is as well. Who is to get access to it? So that will determine who you distribute it to. Or is it all of the organisation? Is it internal? Is it external? Considering all those possibilities, you need to ensure that you maintain control of it, okay, so it doesn't end up in the wrong hands. Access, again, I sort of talked about that up the top as well. So you might put different permissions in place Different people might be able to view documentation, others might be able to view and edit, right? Again, it depends on the type of documentation. Retrieval and use. Retrieval is always an interesting one for me when conducting audits. So I'm always asking, can I see it? So it's always interesting to see how easily people can retrieve or find documentation. So possibly your naming conventions where you save your documented information needs to be clear and understood to ensure that these things can be found. I know it's not perfect. We have the same issue here at Atoll, sometimes we think, where did we put that document? We know we've got it. You can have all of these things in place, and sometimes these things do sort of slip up. Just because it's in the standard doesn't mean it's easy. So this is all this is wanting, is to ensure a simple retrieval process. People can find what they need, all right? And of course, once they found it, then they can use it. And then as I read that, use it and follow it, okay? Is it clear? Then there's B, storage and preservation, including preservation of legibility. This is actually very similar to what I talked about up here with protection. And I use that example of what looked like training records that hadn't been stored adequately or preserved. As a matter of fact, they'd been quite damaged by the weather and rain. So that covers legibility as well. Okay, if they need to refer to these training records, then they actually weren't legible. They weren't able to provide this evidence in a legible format because they hadn't saved copies of them electronically either. So, and look, that's a hard copy example I gave you. The same goes for electronic copies as well. So storage and preservation. Ensure that your documentation that you're saving electronically can't easily be deleted. Oops, that's something that does happen as well. Okay, so have these checks and balances in place. Then point C says control of changes, for example, version control. All right, yeah, very, very important. I get scared when I'm looking at documentation and I can see that it's version 1 dated December 2012, and I'm thinking, oh, that's like 10 years old. Is what I'm reading current? Have they reviewed this? Am I doing the right thing? So version control is very, very important when you're reviewing and updating and controlling your documentation. Okay, so a lot of businesses I go to, and a common one is your policy, a quality policy, which doesn't change that often, and they could become outdated easily. I've seen some quality policies that are 5 or 6 years old. Even though they've been reviewed, there were no changes made, so the company didn't update the version number or the date of the version. So it makes it look like it's old. I always recommend in those instances, look, if you are reviewing documentation and there isn't a change, still update the reviewed date. So it looks like, and you're demonstrating more so, you are demonstrating that you have reviewed it and there were no changes, all right? Then we have D, retention and disposition. Okay, so just recapping, we're talking about the control of documented information, and we need to address the activity of retention and disposition. So how long are we retaining this documentation? Now, remember, when we talk about documented information, it's not just about your procedures, so maintaining documented information as procedures. it's also records and evidence. So it's important to have some sort of retention schedule, particularly with your records and evidence. Like, how long do you need to keep training records for instance? Okay, so need that within your system or processes. And then disposition. So disposition isn't just disposal, it can include archiving. So again, at what point is it okay to dispose of, so shred, or do we archive this? Okay, so you need some sort of time frames in place based on different types of documented information as to how long you'll retain them, and then what the disposition process is. Is it archive and disposal or straight to disposal? Okay, what I do normally see for this type of thing is like a table. People within their systems draw up a table. They have all their different types of documented information, and they might have column headings for how long they're retained, and then the disposition process. Is it archived? Is it disposed of and shredded, etc.? Then it says documented information of external origin determined by the organisation to be necessary for the planning and operation of the quality management system shall be identified as appropriate and be controlled. Okay, this is the key area here. It's saying, look, not only do you have to look after and control your documented information for your internal stuff, if you're receiving documented information externally, so this could be copies of ISO standards, I'll go right in there. It could be legislative documents. It could be drawings or specs or tenders from customers, customer orders, anything that comes from an external origin. These control elements need to be considered as well, all right? It is not just for your internal documentation. So as you're working through this, consider your documents of external origin as well. Then it goes on to say, documented information retained as evidence of conformity shall be protected from unintended alterations. Okay, I'm going to read that again just to process it myself. Documented information retained as evidence of conformity. Okay, so that's records, evidence. I mentioned that above somewhere before. So they're talking about evidence shall be protected from unintended alterations. Oh, that's a very good point, isn't it? So if you're retaining evidence, records, you don't want them to be tampered. Okay, so this goes back to access, right? Storage, preservation as well, retention and disposition. So how you're managing this will influence how or if people can make changes to this evidence, right? So think about that when you're developing your system. And then finally, the note at the end says, access can imply a decision regarding the permission to view the documented information only, or the permission and authority to view and change the documented information. Yeah, I mentioned that up here when I talked about access, right? So you need to consider who can access, one, who can access and just view, and who can access and view and edit as well, right? So that's really important. Okay, I hope that's explained 7532 for you and you're able to implement that within your own business.